Good day, ENGL 221 students. Welcome to Study Unit 2, where we will today look at our short story, The Yellow Wallpaper. Let us begin this study unit and this lecture in the correct way. I would like to read to you a short verse from Psalm 29, verse 11. The Lord gives strength to his people. The Lord blesses his people with peace. And then I ask that you bow your heads now, as I would like to pray this verse over you as a blessing. It is from Numbers 6, verse 24 to 26. Let us pray. May the Lord bless you and protect you. May the Lord smile on you and be gracious to you. May the Lord show you his favor and give you his peace. Amen. And we pray that peace will come over our country as it is so needed at this time. On our work schedule, you will notice that we are in week 2 and we will be discussing study unit 2, the yellow wallpaper. I also just quickly want to draw your attention to your assessment activity 1, the e-quiz, which will be available from Monday the 19th until Friday the 23rd of July. Please ensure that you complete it in the given time, as no extensions will be given. Last week, we also discussed the semester assignment already. Please take note that you have to hand it in no later than the 3rd of September. A quick look at how you can prepare for your assessment activity 1. Please have a look again at the study unit 1 at these slides. The two websites indicated there, those articles, the one about the literary devices and the other one, what is literature. Your activity will be a multiple choice e-quiz, and once again will open on Monday the 19th of July at 7 in the morning and close on Friday the 23rd at 11 at night. Marks 10, time allowed 10 minutes. Let us look at the outcome and assessment criteria of the study unit. Outcome, you should be able to understand the literary terms of a short story. The assessment criteria, you must have a thorough grasp of the context as well as the social, historical and geographical setting of the text. Understand and be able to explain at the hand of any text certain key literary terms. Understand and explain the difference between a theme, a motive and a symbol. Identify the main themes, motives, and symbols in the short story. And lastly, understand how these motives, themes, symbols contribute to create meaning in the text. Let's have a look at the historical setting of our story, the yellow wallpaper, because historical setting, of course, is very important in understanding the context of a story. Now, it was published in 1892. Based in the United States, and the architectural features of the house in the story, and especially the way the narrator describes them, suggests to us that the story also took place during the same era. Also, this was the era, which is the late 19th to early 20th century, of the suffragette movement in Britain and the United States. Now, the suffragette movement was a women's movement, and they campaigned for women's voting rights because, of course, at the time, women did not have voting rights in these countries. Stepping away from the historical setting, if we now look at the social setting of the story, meaning what was life like at this time, especially for women, it was a time when society was still very much dominated by men. Women received very little formal education. There was no talk of going to university. And their lives were still managed by men, of course, especially their husbands once they were married. Marriage was regarded as a required institution for women to survive and also to achieve social status through their husbands. Divorce was frowned upon, even more so than it is today. Let us look at the author of our story, the yellow wallpaper, and there is a picture of her on the slide. Charlotte Perkins Stetson, as she was known during her first marriage, and then Charlotte Perkins Gilman when she remarried later. Now, the story is based largely on her own life. She married her first husband in 1884 and shortly after gave birth to their daughter. Now, she suffered terribly from depression, and with the information we have now, we can say that it was possibly postnatal depression following the birth of her daughter. Her husband, of course, took her to go and see a doctor, and he prescribed rest and isolation treatment, similar to the rest and isolation treatment prescribed to the narrator in our story. Charlotte later divorced her husband and she moved away with their small daughter, but she acknowledged her ex-husband's right to see his daughter, but also felt very strongly that he had a joint responsibility in raising her. She thus sent her daughter back to live with her ex-husband and his second wife. Now, although Charlotte received no formal education, she was a feminist opinion maker, especially the redefining of motherhood and the division of the labor responsibilities in managing a family. She wrote and she lectured extensively on this subject. She married her first cousin in 1900 and was happily married until his death in 1934, and it is of course upon the second marriage that she became known as Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Our character list, if we first look at the narrator, she is a young upper middle class woman. She's newly married, she's a new mother, and she's undergoing care for depression. The narrator, whose name may or may not be Jane, is highly imaginative. She's a natural storyteller, though her doctors believe she has a slight hysterical tendency. The story is told in the form of her secret diary or her journal, in which she records her thoughts as her obsession with the yellow wallpaper grows. Our narrator is a first-person narrator. She has a secret journal in which she shares her thoughts and her feelings about her condition. She suffers from anxiety. It is described as a temporary nervous depression or a slight hysterical tendency. We, of course, now know that it was probably postnatal depression. And she often asks, what is one to do, because she is feeling so bored, because she's an imaginative, creative writer and she craves the stimulation, but is not allowed to do anything as part of her rest cure. John, as the character, he of course is our narrator's husband. We know that he's a physician or a doctor, and he restricts her activities as part of her treatment, so she's not allowed to do very much. He's extremely practical, where he prefers looking at facts and figures to fancy, also just a way to describe imagination, and he scoffs at this fancy, at this imagination of hers openly. So he does not believe it, and he does not want her to imagine things. He seems to love his wife, because he really does want her to get better, but he doesn't understand the negative effect this treatment will have on her. Now, the next character that we read about is Jenny. Jenny is John's sister, so it's the narrator's sister-in-law, and she acts as the housekeeper for the couple while they are taking their summer vacation. Now, Jenny is very happy in this domestic role to just take care of the house, and it's this contentment of Jenny with this domestic role that intensifies the narrator's feelings of guilt, because she does not feel content just being a traditional wife and mother. And Jenny seems at times also to suspect that the narrator is more troubled than she lets on. So Jenny suspects that the narrator is a little bit more troubled and is having a harder time mentally than she wants the others to believe. Another character we come in contact with is Mary. The narrator describes Mary as so good with the baby, and although this caretaker is not mentioned by name again in the story, we learn that the baby is well and happy. So Mary is taking care of the baby. Mary is clearly not only doing her job with the baby, but just like Jenny, she's another force, cutting the narrator off from any useful stimulation or focus. If we look at the room itself, the room with the yellow wallpaper, now yellow is usually associated with happiness and joy, but we know that the narrator does not like the room. She did in fact not even want to be in that room. She wanted the downstairs bedroom. There are barred windows. The narrator thinks it used to be a former nursery, so where the children were kept as babies, where they slept. And the yellow wallpaper, she says that I never saw worse paper in my life. And the color to her is disgusting. She doesn't like it. It is a very ugly color to her. Some of the themes in our short story that we will discuss in more detail later on: the subordination of women in marriage, the importance of self-expression, and the evils of the resting cure. Now, I want you to please think about the following. As a Christian, how would you respond to the following aspects that we encounter in this short story? Marriage, gender roles, depression and mental illness, and work. How would you as a Christian respond to these issues? And what do you think about these issues? What do you think about them, the way they are portrayed in the story and the way we experience them today? Jot down some notes and we will discuss it at a later stage. The narrator of the yellow wallpaper is also a paradox, meaning a contradiction. As she loses touch with the outer world, she comes to a greater understanding of the inner realities of her life. This inner-outer split is crucial for us to understand her suffering. At every point, she is faced with relationships, objects, and situations that seem innocent and natural at first, but they are actually quite bizarre and they are even oppressive. In a sense, the plot of the story is an attempt by the narrator to avoid acknowledging the extent to which her external situation stifle her inner impulses. From the beginning, we see that the narrator is an imaginative, highly expressive woman. She remembers terrifying herself even with nighttime monsters that she thought up, and she enjoys the notion that the house they have taken is haunted. Yet, as part of her cure, her husband forbids her to exercise her imagination in any way. Both her reason and her emotions rebel against this treatment, and she turns her imagination onto seemingly neutral objects such as the house and the wallpaper, in an attempt to ignore her frustration. Her negative feelings color her description of her surroundings, making them seem uncanny and sinister, and she becomes fixated on this yellow wallpaper. As our narrator sinks further into her inner fascination or inner imaginary world, her fascination with this wallpaper, she becomes progressively more dissociated from her day-to-day life. So she loses her grasp on everyday life. The process of dissociation begins when the story does, at that very moment when she decides to keep a secret diary or a secret journal as a relief to her mind. From that point on, her true thoughts and feelings are hidden from the outer world and all of the other characters, and the narrator begins to slip into a fantasy world in which the nature of her situation is made clear in symbolic terms. Gilman shows us this division in the narrator's consciousness by having the narrator puzzled over effects in the world that she herself has caused. For example, the narrator doesn't immediately understand that the yellow stains on her clothing and the long smooch on the wallpaper are connected. Similarly, the narrator fights the realization that the predicament of the woman in the wallpaper is a symbolic version of her own life and her own situation. At first, she even disapproves of this woman's efforts to escape, and she intends to tie her up. When the narrator finally identifies herself with this trapped woman behind the wallpaper, she's able to see other women also. So now she sees more than one. She sees other women are also forced to creep and hide behind this domestic pattern of their lives. And in this case, behind the wallpaper, and it's simply a symbol for women hiding behind domesticity. And she realizes that she herself is also like these women and she is in need of rescue. The horror of this story is that the narrator must lose herself or her own mind to be able to understand herself. She has untangled the pattern of her life, but she has torn herself, her own mind apart in getting free of it. An odd detail at the end of the story actually reveals to us how much the narrator has sacrificed. During her final split from reality, the narrator says, I've got out at last, in spite of you and Jane. Now we ask, who is this Jane? Some critics claim that Jane is just a misprint for Jenny, the sister-in-law, but it is more likely that Jane is the name of the unnamed narrator who has been a stranger to herself and her jailers. Now she is horribly free of the constraints of her marriage, her society, and her own efforts to repress her mind. But isn't it very sad that the only way that she has become free now is by becoming mentally insane? We must, of course, understand in the context of the story, we must understand our author. Charlotte Perkins Gilman was best known in her time as a crusading journalist and a feminist intellectual, a follower of such pioneering women's rights. She argued that women's obligation to remain in the domestic sphere, meaning women's obligation to remain at home raising children, robbed them of the expression of their full powers of creativity and intelligence. So it robbed them of an opportunity to be creative and to use their intelligence, while simultaneously robbing society of women whose abilities suited them for professional and public life. She goes on to say that also simultaneously, by keeping women in the kitchen and in the house and not allowing them to work and use their intelligence, we also rob society of the contributions of these intelligent women. An essential part of her analysis was that the traditional power structure of the family made no one happy, not the woman who was made into an unpaid servant, and not the husband who was made into a master, and not even the children who were subject to both. Her most ambitious work, Women and Economics, published in 1898, analyzed the hidden value of women's labor within the capitalist economy, and she argued that financial independence for women could only benefit society as a whole. Today, Gilman is primarily known for this one remarkable story, The Yellow Wallpaper, which was considered almost unprintably shocking in its time and which unnerves readers to this day. This short work of fiction, which deals with an unequal marriage and a woman destroyed by her unfulfilled desire for self-expression, deals with the same concerns and ideas as Gilman's non-fiction works, but in a much more personal mode. Indeed, The Yellow Wallpaper draws heavily on a particularly painful episode in Gilman's own life. In 1886, early in her first marriage and not long after the birth of her daughter, Charlotte Perkins Stetson, as she was then known, was stricken with a severe case of depression. In her 1935 autobiography, The Living of Charlotte Perkins Gilman, she describes her utter prostration by unbearable inner misery. Now, prostration is when you cannot get up, you have no energy, and she says this was caused by unbearable inner misery and ceaseless tears, meaning tears that would not stop, a condition only made worse by the presence of her husband and her baby. Now, this, of course, is a textbook case of postnatal depression. She was then referred to Dr. S. Weir Mitchell. He was at the time the country's leading specialist in nervous disorders, or what we would today call a neurologist. And his treatment for such cases was the so-called rest cure. Especially in the case of his female patients, he believed that their depression was caused between too much mental activity, meaning too much thinking, and not enough attention to domestic affairs, so not enough attention to taking care of their home and their children. For Gilman, of course, this treatment was a disaster because it implied that the woman would not be allowed to do anything. All she had to do was rest, not think, not read, not write. And when Gilman was prevented from working, she soon had a nervous breakdown. At her worst, and this is very sad, she was reduced to crawling into closets, under beds, clutching a rag doll. Now, once Gilman abandoned Dr. Mitchell's rest cure, she improved quite drastically and quite quickly, but she did claim that the effects of this ordeal was felt for the rest of her life. She left behind her husband and a child, which was quite scandalous at the time, and she moved to California, and she embarked on a successful career as a journalist, a lecturer, and a publisher. And of course, she also took the name Charlotte Perkins Gilman after her second marriage. Now, she wrote the yellow wallpaper soon after her move to California, and in it she uses her personal experience to create a tale that is both a chilling description of one woman's fall into madness and a potent symbolic narrative of the fate of a creative woman stifled by a paternalistic culture. In our story, The Yellow Wallpaper, we can find different literary ways of writing. Firstly, it looks simply as if it is written in the tradition of a psychological horror or a psychological horror tale, much as Edgar Allan Poe wrote his stories. For example, his The Telltale Heart is also told from the point of view of an insane narrator. If you look a little bit further, however, Gilman also drew on the traditions of the Gothic romance of the late 18th century, which often featured spooky old mansions and young heroines determined to uncover their secrets, such as Jane Eyre or Wuthering Heights. Gilman's story, however, is also forward-looking, and her moment-by-moment reporting of the narrator's thoughts is clearly a move in the direction of that sort of stream of consciousness narration that was used by 20th century writers such as Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, and William Faulkner. As part of our plot overview, we continue. The narrator begins her journal by marveling at the grandeur of the house and the grounds that her husband has taken for their summer vacation. She describes it in very romantic terms. She calls it an aristocratic estate, or sometimes even a haunted house, and she wonders how they are able to afford it. And she even wonders why the house had been empty for so long. Her feeling that there is something queer, something strange about the situation, leads her into a discussion of her illness. She's suffering from a nervous depression, and also a discussion of her marriage. Our narrator complains that her husband John, who is also her doctor, belittles her illness. This we know postnatal depression that she has, and he also belittles her thoughts and her concerns in general, so he does not listen to her. She contrasts his practical, rationalistic manner of thinking about the world with her own imaginative, sensitive ways. Her treatment requires that she do almost nothing active, and she's especially forbidden from working and writing. She feels that activity, freedom, and interesting work would help her condition, and reveals that she has begun a secret journal in order to relieve her mind. So in this secret journal, first of all, she describes the house. That's where she begins. And in the beginning, it's mostly positive, but there are some disturbing elements because when she's describing the room, she talks about the bars on the windows, rings and things in the bedroom, so where something was attached to, we don't know what yet. She particularly describes the yellow wallpaper. With its strange and formless pattern, and she describes it as revolting. Soon, however, her thoughts are interrupted because John approaches and she has to stop writing. As the first few weeks of the summer pass, the narrator becomes good at hiding her journal and thus also hiding her truth, feelings, and thoughts from John. She continues to long for more stimulating company and activity. She even asks him if her cousin can come and visit. He, of course, refuses, and she complains also about John's patronizing, controlling ways, although she immediately returns to the wallpaper, which now has moved from seeming ugly to her to oddly menacing, and menacing means there's danger. She mentions that John is worried about her becoming fixated on the wallpaper, which is why he refuses to have the room repapered when she tells him that she does not like the wallpaper. He does not want to give in to her neurotic worries. The narrator, however, her imagination has been aroused. She cannot stop thinking about this wallpaper. She also mentions that she enjoys picturing people on the walkways around the house, and John is very quick to discourage this. She also thinks back to her own childhood, where she would even imagine and create in her mind terrible monsters to be creative. As she describes the bedroom, which she says must have been a nursery for young children, she also points out that the paper is torn off from the wall in certain spots and that there are scratches and gouges on the floor and that the furniture is heavy and fixed in place. Just as she begins to see a strange sub-pattern behind the main design of the wallpaper, her writing is interrupted again, and this time by John's sister Jenny, who is their housekeeper and also her nurse. Now, very soon this wallpaper dominates her imagination and she becomes possessive and very secretive, and she hides her interest in the paper and she makes sure no one else will look at it or examine it so that she can find out what's going on behind this wallpaper. She wants to find out on her own. At one point, she even startles Jenny, who's been touching the wallpaper and who mentions to her that she's found yellow stains on their clothes. Now, John mistakenly thinks that this fixation on the wallpaper is a sign of tranquility and that the narrator is improving, when in actual fact she's sleeping less and less, and she's now even convinced that she can smell the paper all over the house. She discovers a strange smudge mark on the paper running all around the room, as if someone has rubbed on the wallpaper by crawling against the wall. As the story progresses, this sub-pattern that the narrator has seen, now clearly resembles the outline of a woman who's trying to get out from behind the wallpaper. And the narrator sees her even at night shaking at the bars in front of the window and creeping around during the day when the woman is able to escape just for a brief moment. The narrator also mentions that she creeps around at times, and she suspects that John and Jenny are aware of her obsession, and she resolves to destroy the paper once and for all, and she decides that she will peel it off from the walls that night. The next day she manages to be alone, and she goes into something of a frenzy, biting and tearing at the paper so that she can free this woman who's trapped behind it and that she sees struggling from inside the pattern. And by the end, the narrator is hopelessly insane, convinced that there are many creeping women behind this wallpaper and that she herself has come out from behind the wallpaper. She creeps endlessly around the room, smudging the wallpaper. When John finally breaks into the locked room and he sees the full horror of this situation, he faints in the doorway, and now she has to creep all over him every time. Let's look at the themes we discussed earlier. First, we look at the subordination of women in marriage. In the yellow wallpaper, Gilman uses the conventions of the psychological horror tale, meaning the ways in which a psychological horror tale is written, to critique the position of women within the institution of marriage, especially as it was practiced by the respectable classes of her time. When the story was first published, most readers thought that it was just a scary tale about a woman in an extreme state of consciousness, a gripping, disturbing entertainment, but little more. After its rediscovery in the 20th century, however, readings of the story have become more complex. For Gilman, the conventional 19th century middle-class marriage, with its rigid distinction between the domestic functions of the woman and the active work of the husband, ensured that women remained second-class citizens. The story further reveals that this gender revision had the effect of keeping women in a childish state of ignorance and prevented them from full development. John's assumption of his own superior wisdom and maturity, meaning he knows best and he's the adult, leads him to misjudge, patronize, and dominate his wife, all in the name of helping her. The narrator is reduced to acting like a cross, petulant child, unable to stand up for herself without seeming unreasonable or disloyal. The narrator has no say in even the smallest details of her life, and she retreats into this obsessive fantasy, the only place where she can retain some control and exercise the power of her mind. Now, the second theme we look at, the importance of self-expression. The mental constraints placed upon the narrator, even more so than the physical ones, are what ultimately drives her insane. She's forced to hide her anxieties and her fears in order to preserve this facade that she has a happy marriage and to make it seem as though she's winning the fight against her depression. From the beginning, The most intolerable aspect of her treatment is the compulsory silence and idleness of the resting cure. She's forced to become completely passive, forbidden from exercising her mind in any way. Writing is especially off limits, and John warns her several times that she must use her self-control to rein in her imagination, which he fears will run away with her. Of course, the narrator's eventual insanity is a product of her repressing her imagination, not expressing it. She's constantly longing for an emotional and intellectual outlet, even going so far as to keep a secret journal, which she describes more than once as a relief for her mind. For Gilman, a mind that is kept in a state of forced inactivity is doomed to self-destruction. As someone who was almost herself destroyed by this Dr. Weir Mitchell's resting cure for depression, it's not surprising that Gilman structured her story as an attack on his ineffective and cruel course of treatment. The yellow wallpaper is an illustration of the way a mind that is already plagued with anxiety, in this case, in the case of the story and in Gilman's own life, it was postnatal depression, can deteriorate and begin to prey on itself when it is forced into inactivity and kept from healthy work. To his credit, of course, Dr. Mitchell, who's mentioned by name in the story, did take Gilman's criticism to heart, and he abandoned the resting cure upon reading the story. Now, if we continue with the evils of the resting cure, beyond just describing this technique in her story, Gilman also means to criticize any form of medical care that ignores the concerns of the patient, considering her only as a passive object of treatment. The connection between a woman's subordination in the home and her subordination in a doctor-patient relationship is clear. John is, after all, the narrator's husband and her doctor. Gilman implies that both forms of authority, that of husband over wife and doctor over patient, can easily be abused, even when the doctor or the husband means well. All too often, the women who are the silent subjects of this authority are infantilized or even worse, ignored. When we look at the motive of irony in the story, almost every aspect of the yellow wallpaper is ironic in some way. Now, irony, remember, is the way of using words to convey multiple levels of meaning that contrast with or complicate one another. In verbal irony, as we see it in the story, words are frequently used to convey the exact opposite of their literal meaning. Just as when a person would say to you, if you make a mistake in your work, nice work. That's sarcasm, which is an example of verbal irony. In her journal, the narrator uses verbal irony often, especially when she refers to her husband. She writes things like, "John laughs at me, of course, but one expects that in marriage." Now, obviously, you do not expect that in a healthy marriage, that a husband would laugh at the concerns of his wife. Later on, she says, "I'm glad my case is not serious," at a point when the reader can very clearly see that her case is indeed very serious. We move from verbal irony to dramatic irony. Dramatic irony occurs when there is a contrast between the reader, ourselves, between our knowledge and the knowledge of the character in the work. Dramatic irony is used extensively in the yellow wallpaper. For example, when the narrator first describes the bedroom John has chosen for them, she attributes the room's bizarre features like the rings and the bars on the wall. She attributes that to the fact that it must have been a nursery once. As readers, we of course know that there's a more plausible explanation than it being a nursery. The room was used for an insane person. Another example of dramatic irony is when the narrator assumes that Jenny shares her interest in the wallpaper, when it's not the case. Jenny was just interested in the wallpaper because she was noticing the yellow stains on the clothing. The effect intensifies towards the end of the story as the narrator sinks further into this fantasy world, and the reader remains able to see her actions from the outside. We can see how she is slowly becoming insane. By the time the narrator fully identifies with the trapped woman she sees in the wallpaper, The reader can appreciate the narrator's experience from her point of view, as well as John's shock at what he sees when he breaks down the door to the bedroom. The third type of irony that we discuss is situational irony. Situational irony refers to moments when a character's actions have the opposite of their intended effect. And such an example would be John's course of treatment backfires. He believes in this resting cure for his wife, but it backfires and it makes her depression worse when what he was trying to do was to cure her, and that in fact is actually the treatment actually drives his wife insane. Similarly, there is a deep irony in the way the narrator's fate develops. She gains a kind of power and insight into what she needs to be happy and what she needs in her life, only by losing what we would call her self-control and her reason. Another motive we will discuss is the journal in the story. The narrator writes to herself. It shows the narrator's descent into madness, both subjectively and objectively, so from the outside as well as from the inside. As it is, the reader must decipher the ambiguity of the story. Ambiguity is when something has a double meaning, just as the narrator must attempt to decipher the bewildering story of her life and the bizarre patterns of the wallpaper. It gives the story an intense intimacy and immediacy, this keeping of the journal, especially in those moments when the narrative or the story is interrupted by the approach of John or Jenny. These interruptions perfectly illustrate the constraints placed on the narrator by authority figures who urge her not to think about her condition. Now, the wallpaper as a symbol. Clearly, the wallpaper represents the structure of family, medicine, and the tradition in which the narrator finds herself trapped. Wallpaper is domestic and humble, and Gilman skillfully uses this nightmarish, hideous paper as a symbol of the domestic life that has trapped so many, and that Gilman herself, one could say, views as nightmarish and hideous. In your preparation for next week, we will continue to discuss the yellow wallpaper. Please make sure that you have read the story and then also read the notes on the websites that you see indicated there, and have a look at the videos, the YouTube videos you see indicated there. Please work through your study unit 2 in your activity pack, work through those questions, and read study unit 3, page 20 to 25 in your study guide.